Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to have you here at the American Enterprise Institute for a great conversation. My name is Mike McShane. I'm a research fellow in education policy studies here at AEI, and we're so excited to have this panel, Empowering Parents and Voters for K-12 Education Reform. We're going to have the opportunity to see two new very interesting pieces of research coming to understand both the decision-making processes that parents take in school choice and also understanding efforts that have been at play around the country to support parents as they advocate for education reform for greater school options. So the way the panel is going to go today, we'll have both presentations, and then we have a slate of distinguished respondents that we're so happy to have with us. They'll have a chance to talk. I'll moderate a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. For those of you that are following along in the live stream at home, hopefully I'm pointing at the right camera up there, if you'd like to participate in the conversation, you can follow along on Twitter. Actually, for those of you in the audience who perhaps are shy and would like to ask a question, that's okay too. The hashtag is AEI Parent Power. Okay, just all run together, AEI Parent Power. Now, before we begin, we do want to thank the Walton Family Foundation for their generous support that made today possible. So first off, we are going to have John Vallant, who's a postdoctoral fellow in the Education Research Alliance of New Orleans at Tulane University in its Department of Economics. He is a researcher of education policy and politics, focusing especially on school choice. His dissertation that he recently worked on examines how school choosing parents and eighth graders respond to various types of school performance information, which is a lot of what he's going to be speaking out about today, and whether school choosing parents and democratic citizens have different desires for the goals that schools pursue. So without further ado, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. And if this is one of the last times I talk about my dissertation, that would be fine with me. So last night I was reading Andrew's very nice piece, and it struck me that there's a classic book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, in which Albert Hirschman talks about how there are two ways that people who feel like they're not being served well by the organizations they're participating in can find themselves a better situation. And one is voice, which is very much what Andrew's paper is about, which is from within the organization trying to improve it and then sort of enjoy the benefits of the improvement. And the second is exit, which is just to leave and go and try to find something better. And so the papers I'm going to talk about fall a little bit more on the side of exit in that they're a little more school choice focused. And so to motivate, the potential benefits from more deeply engaging parents in the public in schools are genuinely immense. And so this is, I think, the logic of school choice. And I like to think, when I think of school choice, I like to think of the fuel of school choice, if it actually is going to exert pressure for school improvement. The fuel is parents' love of their own kids and their familiarity with their own kids. That's what I think school choice reforms are really trying to tap into, and they're trying to use that for some kind of public good by sort of releasing parents and letting them go pick their own kids' schools and taking what they know about their kids and taking the fact that they really love their kids and trying to turn that into a positive force in education. And the same goes for the kind of voice within schools too. So parents who are aware of their schools and willing to sort of speak up when they see something that they like or they don't like in their schools, it's just as true there. And on the public side, you have schools as accessible and really important political institutions. So they're these local institutions that people actually can see and they feel comfortable with. And there's an opportunity to get the public more involved in a way that could be really useful. The challenge is that engaging parents in the public, it's hard. People are busy and it's very difficult to even access schools. And so in the brief that's around, I talk a bit about school choosers as boundedly rational. So there's this view that I think I often hear when people talk about school choice that has origins in neoclassical economics, where people talk about an economic man who, in the school choice context, would sort of survey all of the school choices that are available to him, score each one in terms of how much it satisfies criteria for choosing a school, and then picks the one that gets the highest score. But that's not what anyone does. So we know from quite a bit of research that people aren't that sort of classically rational. They're what Herb Simon would call boundedly rational. And so in the school choice context, you see a lot of people who will only ever consider one school or maybe two schools. And when they do, when they go and they try to collect information on the schools, they're using shortcuts and they're interpreting it in ways that we might not expect. And then when it comes time to make a decision, it's often not the case that they're going and picking the one that scored the best, but rather that we go and we search, and when we find one that feels good enough, we say, let's do that. And so people in this process, people are they're taking on information in ways we might not expect. And if we're assuming that they are this kind of classically rational chooser, then we may inform them in ways that aren't actually helpful. And so what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to give very brief kind of big picture overviews of two different studies with school choosers and in one case the public. And then I don't have too much time to get into too many details, so feel free to follow up. But the basic question here is, how does information affect the schools that people choose and the way that they engage politically? Okay, so for the first study, which I worked on with Susanna Loeb, who's a professor at Stanford, we were testing how the provision of information affects people's school choices by randomly assigning different families to receive different types of information before they chose schools. And we did it in 3 cities, in Milwaukee, here in DC, and then also in Philadelphia. And the basic idea in Milwaukee and DC was the same, which was we provided a booklet that was created by grade schools, and I'll show you a sample in a second, to some randomly selected groups of parents and kids who were choosing middle schools or high schools. And for other families, we did not provide the same booklet. So what we're going to look at is, did the families who randomly were picked to get the booklet, did they end up picking different types of schools from the families that didn't get the booklet? And we administered the study through kids' schools. So for families choosing middle schools, we distributed the booklets and then also did some service work with families in their elementary schools. So these were 5th grade families going up from 5th grade to 6th grade. And then same thing for middle schools going 8th grade on to high school. And in Philadelphia, we had kind of a similar design where there's a booklet that's what we would call the treatment. And so we're giving school choosers who are choosing high schools in Philadelphia a booklet. And in this case, it was at a high school fair, and we were working both with parents and with 8th grade students. So there's a sense that 8th grade students are really involved in choosing their own high schools, and maybe especially in urban areas. And so we wanted to pick apart that for reasons that you'll see in a second. And then we administered in Philadelphia, so people were literally picking up envelopes that had a 1 or a 2, and so it was randomly assigned, and everyone filled out a survey, but only the people who I think got the 2s read through the booklet first. And so we're going to try to understand what the effect of the booklet was by comparing the responses of people who saw the booklet from people who did not. And so just a quick kind of picture of what this is. So these are from bottom left kind of on up. This is DC, Milwaukee, and then Philadelphia. And these are part of bigger booklets that have a lot of information on the front end about how a family might conduct a school search, but the meat of the booklet is these school profiles. And they differ a bit from city to city, but in each case they have some kind of simplified rating of school performance. It's stars in DC, these green light, yellow light, red lights in Milwaukee, and then a numerical rating system in Philadelphia. And what we're going to look at is how getting those booklets affected people's choices. And so in Milwaukee and DC, what we saw was very, very different patterns across school levels that were actually very similar across cities. So for middle school choosers, families that were going from elementary school to middle school, when the families that were randomly assigned to get one of those booklets tended to choose higher rated schools as a result of getting the booklet. In high school, it actually went in the exact opposite way. They chose lower rated schools on average. And we were trying to figure out why. And we kept coming back to the possibility that kids were playing a role in this. So we know kids are involved in choosing high schools. And it may be that kids respond differently to the same information, or that in providing information to kids, we were converting some choices from parents to kids. So in Philadelphia, we looked and we worked with both parents and 8th graders. And what we saw was, again, a split. Parents responded very, very differently from kids. So for parents, you got what seemed like a lot of positive effects. When they got the booklets, they focused on higher rated schools. They reported being better aware of their options, and their opinions of schools came into alignment with the booklet's opinions. They said they were more confident in their ability to choose well, and they were more focused on academic quality. For kids, you got essentially none of that. And in fact, the one place where it looks like there may have been an effect, the kids who got the booklet were actually looking at slightly lower performing schools. So study 2, which I'm going to talk about even faster, is here the idea is to sort of step back and put in context how do parents and how do the public respond to these types of numerical official government ratings as opposed to narrative parent comments about schools. And basically what this was is it was a nationally representative survey where if someone was filling out the survey, she would have punched in her zip code, and then I would have spit back 2 schools that were in her neighborhood with these kind of mini profiles of the schools. And the profiles would have had a 1 to 10 academic rating that came from great schools. It was based on test scores and school performance. And then 2 very short comments from parents. And for one of the schools, there were 2 positive comments, and for the other school, there were 2 negative comments. And it was randomly assigned which would have the positive and which would have the negative. And then after they saw that, we asked all of the respondents to grade the school overall in terms of what they believe about its quality, knowing all they know, from A+ through F. And then there was some follow-up work so that was with a company called YouGov, and some follow-up work with Mechanical Turk, which is this Amazon.com thing. To see why it was that they might have preferred some information over other types of information. And the basic takeaway was that parents and the public both updated their opinions when they saw these numerical ratings. So when they saw a higher rated school, it did lead them to like that school more, and for causal reasons. There was something about seeing a higher number that actually did lead them to update and say they liked the school better. But the parent comments, which were from anonymous, these are anonymous comments being fed to them through a computer screen from local parents, had an enormous immediate effect on their opinion of the schools. So just seeing these 2 positive comments versus 2 negative comments was enough to bump their impression about 2/3 of a full letter grade. So from about a C+ on average to about a B, if you're comparing the schools receiving the negative comments to the schools receiving the positive comments. It was a very, very large effect. And then the follow-up work showed that the reasons why they seemed so drawn to the narrative parents' comments were both because of a preference for the source. They very much liked hearing from parents more than they liked hearing from government. And also the style, that there was a strong preference for narrative comments over numerical ratings generally. And so just to follow up on a couple other kind of specifics. So where parents were preferred to government, it was also the case that nonprofit ratings were trusted much more than government ratings were trusted, which is Bill's favorite finding, I think. And it was also the case that when it came to the government ratings and comments, these kind of brief expert reports from government observers actually did quite well. They didn't do as well as anything that parents said, but people tended to believe what the government would say if it would say it in words rather than just saying it in a number. And just as a last slide to wrap up. So as I said, I think there's a lot of potential for engaging parents and engaging the public. It's difficult to do. And so I think there's some risk that we think if we just put out what looks like good information and it seems like accurate information, that more information is better and people will interpret it the way we hope. And so then we'll just sort of set everyone free and they'll make decisions that exert the kind of pressures that we want on schools. But people don't always behave in the ways that we expect. So I have a few takeaways in the report, kind of particularly related to school choosers. But the takeaways are first of all, being very aware of the audience and the differences in different audiences. So for example, parents and kids likely respond to the same information very differently. And for 13-year-olds who are thinking about a high school, it may be that a booklet that says that these schools are higher rated and these schools are lower rated is just not what speaks to them. And actually one hypothesis we're pursuing is that when 13-year-olds see one school that's highly rated, it actually intimidates them and they think that's not where I want to spend the next 4 years and might sort of push them out. So knowing the audience and thinking about how to serve the different audiences, recognizing the potential value and risk of narrative comments. So these really can influence what people think and do, which could be used for good. It can also distort behaviors. Third here is strive to broaden consideration sets. So when I said that people often only consider 1 or 2 schools, a big part of this work is just getting them to consider more than that first school or two. And then finally, finding balance between being accurate, so making sure that any information we're putting out there is true, with being accessible and acknowledging that people are busy and they might not have time to read everything we put out, but at the same time accommodating the families that do actually want to go and read more and learn more. And I will leave it there.
John. Outstanding and plenty of fodder for discussion, which is great. Next up, we have Andrew Kelly. Andrew is the director of the Center for Higher Education Reform and a resident scholar in education policy studies here at AEI. While his work, a lot of his work centers on higher education, he's done plenty of scholarly work on K-12. It's been published in many top journals. He's edited several books and is a regular columnist at Forbes Opinion. He has a really fascinating paper that he's going to be presenting today entitled Turning Lightning into Electricity, Organizing Parents for Education Reform. Have at it.
Thank you, Michael. And thanks John for whipping through that as quickly as he did. That's a lot. The paper is terrific, and I recommend you all read it. He did an excellent job, and I just think the lessons there are really important for policymakers. I do think that I appreciate the way that he introduced this. My paper is about political voice and about the ability of parents, the main clients of public schools, to organize themselves into a political bloc. I'm trying to advance here. It's a really thick study. It started out as a couple of papers, and it turned sort of into like this, almost like a book, but more like a monograph. So I'm going to do the unenviable job of trying to summarize that in 10 minutes. I would love for people to read it. Please send me email and discuss it with me as much as you like. The title comes actually from Raymond and his friends in Louisiana, Stand for Children organizers. And it comes from the notion that lightning is an extremely powerful force, but it strikes at random and it disappears quickly as soon as it's over. Electricity is something you can channel to useful ends and turn off and on when you need it. And in Louisiana, they told me that their goal in organizing parents is to be more like electricity than lightning, to turn that lightning that parents often feel in terms of being aggrieved and angry about the quality of their schools, turn that into electricity. And I thought that was just a terrific metaphor for what political organizers really are trying to do everywhere, not just in education. So why is politics important? Well, because for all the technocratic fervor that ed reformers have engaged in over the past decade or 15 years about elegant policies and what percentage of teacher evaluation should be made up by test scores or value added or whatever. Schools, at the end of the day, are the product of politics, right? They are politically controlled. They're democratically controlled, for better or for worse. And so it's always been my impression, and I will stand corrected if it's not true, that ed reformers have paid much less attention to political power and the rough and tumble of politics. They've had actually a remarkable run in light of that, I think, actually. But in places like New York City and in the state of Indiana, for instance, you've seen how political fortunes can change quickly and threaten to undo a lot of the progress that reformers have made. So the point of the paper is to sort of think, how do ed reformers think about engaging the constituencies that they're purportedly trying to help? How do they enlist them in this fight for better schools? And in some cases, how do they pass the baton to those constituents to make this case? So why are parents important? Well, they're the primary clients of the public schools. John Chubb and Terry Moe have this absolutely devastating passage in their book about parents have every right to participate in the democratic politics of schooling, but they have no right to win. And they take what society gives them, right? It's a pretty bold statement, but I think oftentimes it's correct. The interesting thing, though, is despite ed reformers' sort of overall lack of attention to politics, there are groups that are out there right now and have been for the past 5-10 years, in case of Stand for Children, much longer, that are actually testing Chubb and Mo's hypothesis directly, and that is if we were to actually organize parents into a lasting political bloc, could they be more influential on school education policy? So that's the good news, that they're out there trying, and the bad news slash not necessarily bad, is that we have an opportunity to learn a lot. We don't know much, so that's the bad news. But we have an opportunity to learn a lot, which is good news. And quickly, I'm just going to whip through this because I don't have a whole lot of time. But the challenge of parent organizing is as follows: there's a notion, I think, out there that suburban parents participate. Affluent suburban parents participate in education politics at much higher rates. It's just not quite true based on the data. So in the paper, I just walk through a couple different data sets that allow you to look at this. Participation in school board meetings and town meetings about education is particularly low. And there aren't actually big differences across income groups, at least according to my analysis. These are from the National Election Study. This chart, which is in 2012, which is a study, a representative sample of Americans, disaggregated by income group, and the columns all the way on the left are attended a school board, a town or school board meeting. Pretty low participation overall, and not huge gaps between income groups. You see these other measures of political participation. This is, have you participated in the last 4 years in one of these things, right? In one of these activities. Things barely register, like participate in a protest march or write a letter to a news magazine or to a newspaper or magazine based on a political issue. These are parents only, parents of school-age kids. This is just a different way to slice it. One thing I would point out here is the bars all the way on the right. This is also from the National Election Survey. The bars all the way on the right are: do you belong to one or more groups, social groups or civic groups? And there actually is a big income difference there. So why is parent participation so low in education politics and in civic activism? Well, there's a collective action problem, first and foremost, right? This is Mansur-Olson's logic of collective action, which suggests that in the pursuit of public goods, from which you cannot be excluded. So things like clean air, safe streets, and good public schools. You don't actually have much incentive to pay the costs of participating, because you'll benefit from those who do participate, whether you participate or not, right? Which, if everybody has that calculation, it starts to fall apart, and nobody wants to participate anyway, right? There are ways you can get around the collective action problem that Olson acknowledges. This is actually one thing that, it's one of those books, sort of like Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, that people don't often read till the end. So if you do read Olson to the end, he actually does describe ways in which you can get around this. One of them is by what he calls selective incentives. And selective incentives can be social, and that can be, if your group is small enough, right, and people will, and your reputation depends on whether you participate and participate actively, then you may actually have incentive to participate. So group size is actually an important variable that he describes, and it actually came up quite a bit in my work here. So what else? Well, there's been a decline in civic engagement overall. This is Bob Putnam's work, Bowling Alone. There's been this sort of secular change. People don't participate in politics, especially at the local level, especially in things that require cooperating with other people in town and in your community. What else? Well, there's low levels of political efficacy. This is one of my favorite Gary Larson cartoons. It says, I thought I could. It's the little engine that couldn't, I suppose. So there's low levels of political efficacy and those are that's especially true in low-income communities and communities of color. And political efficacy is simply the belief that you can change things about the world via the political process. What else? Well, there's a lot of, you need to have high levels of social trust to engage in collective action, right? If you don't trust the people that you're working with, you're not going to be very good at starting a group. Levels of social trust are particularly low, again, among in lower income communities. And then lastly, education policy debates, the sort of ed reform debates, are subject to lots of tangentious politics and misinformation, which political scientists have shown that actually, like, receiving a lot of conflicting messages can demobilize people. If you're conflict avoidant, you just say, I don't want to deal with this. This is crazy. Everybody's yelling at me. Forget it. That's what these parent organizing groups are up against. So how do they get around the obstacles? Well, I asked them, right? And I'm going to take a little extra time, Sarah. Thank you for the time cards. So I asked them, and this is not a representative sample of parent groups. It's an opportunity sample. It was groups that I had come in contact with and that had national reach or statewide reach. I would urge researchers to take on a more systematic look at this and come up with other ways. This is a first cut, and I'd love to hear what people have other ideas about how to study this. The key takeaway here, and it actually comes out from a lot of the literature I just described, is that politics is a social contact sport, right? And what I mean by that is that it's less about sort of the economic man, right, that John was describing. It's less about, do I see value to myself in participating or not? And it's actually a lot more about whether there's social pressure for you to participate, right? Are you asked to participate? Are you asked by somebody who knows you and would be disappointed in you if you didn't show up? So one of the most fascinating things that's been going on in politics over the last 10 years is these experiments that randomly assign people to receive information that your voting record is public, right? And so they'll send you a letter and it says, we know whether or not you voted and your neighbors will know too, right? And they found that actually boosts political participation, voter turnout, by a significant margin, right? Door-to-door canvassing, same thing. If you get door-to-door canvassed as opposed to a robocall, right? Robocall, you get a call, it's like this, Hillary Clinton says, please turn out to vote, right? If you get door-to-door canvass, especially if you get door-to-door canvass by Cory Booker, who that is right there, you're probably likely to turn out. Again, social ties, right? And then this is supposed to depict a social network here. Campaigns tend to focus on people who have very large pre-existing social networks, because by mobilizing them, they can leverage that social network. So that's sort of what I found in studying this. So I'm just going to whip through this really quickly. Let's get past this. These are important questions, but I'll leave those to the side. Recruiting parent volunteers. What do? You pick people with pre-existing social networks. They can then go out and build the organization. They can be the face of the organization, and they're organizers are selective. They don't just take a butterfly net. That's actually Vladimir Nabokov, who I didn't know he was a butterfly collector, but yeah, that's where that picture's from. That's the first thing that comes up on Google image search. So they don't use a butterfly net, right? They're very conscious about selecting parents that have deep social networks. What about how should you convince parents to join up? Well, this is also in keeping with, I think, some of John's lessons, which are data and sort of abstract policy arguments are often not persuasive to parents, right? They want to hear personal narratives and stories about why people got engaged. They also want to hear concrete plans about how to change things, right? And then this is a key one that I promise I'll finish up. But what I found also is that there's a tension here between groups that measure membership lists and basically email lists as their membership, right? And then people who are like, yeah, that's sort of our membership, but like 5% of them actually ever do anything, right? And so I would urge stakeholders like funders and others, don't measure email lists as a measure of group strength. Measure the number of parents who are active on a regular basis. And then I'll just whip through this quickly. This is all in the paper, so please go read it. The last thing I want to finish up on is just sustaining engagement. And why is that important? Well, it's important because policy implementation, policy doesn't stop, the policy debate doesn't stop when a policy is enacted, right? It's a big game of telephone after that, which is the implementation process. And ed reformers are paid somewhat less attention to that. And the key is that at every juncture, the policy can be undone. And this requires a very different approach to politics and organizing to have influence in the implementation process than it does to have influence on electoral politics and policy enactment. So this is a big time looming challenge that groups haven't quite figured out how to deal with yet. Some are better than others, but it's something that they're going to have to figure out. The thing I'll leave you with quickly is one thing that I heard a lot about was groups trying to figure out how to change ed reform from something that's done to parents to something that's done through parents. And that's a big challenge because groups have agendas and they have policy, preferences, and they want to see those things enacted. Handing power over to parents, handing the keys of the operation over to the parents can be, it can actually help sustain parent engagement over time, give them ownership over the process, but it also can threaten the coherence of your agenda. So I'm way over time, so I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Outstanding, thank you. But you packed every one of those minutes in, so that was outstanding. Well, now we'll have a chance to have 3 responses to what you've already seen from folks with really intimate knowledge of parent organizing, of informing parents, and of this. So I think we're just going to head down the line. So our first respondent will be Raymond Alman, who's an education fellow at 50CAN. Before his time at 50CAN, he served as the managing city director and national organizing coach at Stand for Children, helping parents across the nation find their voice and take action to ensure that their children graduate from high school prepared for college and life. So please, take it away.
How you guys doing? Thanks for the invite to be here. Thankful some of my 50CAN colleagues are here too, Daniela and Lisa. They told me I had 10 minutes, and I was like, man, I'm the son of a Southern preacher. Like, our warm-up comments are like 30 minutes. But I'll jump right in. Today, knock that down. Today, really, I'm just going to kind of give 3 things. So 2 broad observations of the research, and then 1 question. And so the first observation from the research that really jumped on me, and Andrew and I have talked about this, is that people really do matter in this work. As we do our work, we often talk about policy, accountability, but we rarely talk about the people in the educational excellence space. And so the parents, the students, the professionals, the politicians, they all matter, they all deserve attention. And this research gives them that attention. And so I think that was great. In John's piece, when you look at the people of that piece, it's really the choosers, the families, the parents and the students that are selecting schools. And I've been grappling with this concept that there's an extreme focus in ed reform now on what I call the new choice class, right? So these are poor people of color that never had a choice, right? And so they are a new class of people. And John had an interesting discussion on the boundedly rational consumer. And I think you should really go and dig into that and look at that because we shouldn't gloss over the limits in knowledge and computational capacity of the new choice class. I mean, those are some real boundaries. And the limits are such that some consumers they really are crippled and they can't make a choice. And I know you've probably heard that before, and people jump all down people's choice. Like, what are you saying? Parents don't know how to choose. But, you have some constraints. You have some limitations. And as I've worked in this space, the awareness of these limits have caused me to constantly ask the question, what can I do to expand the knowledge and capacity of the new choice class? And so that's a question we should always think about as we're doing our work. In Andrew's work, and Andrew, I told Andrew earlier, he quoted me several times in his paper, which was great because usually I'm quoted in the local newspaper and it's nothing like that. And so, so I was thankful for that. But in Andrew's research, he talks about the messengers, right? And so a lot of times we focus on messaging, how we're going to, put these numbers together. But the messengers and specifically the organizers, we have a lot of different professionals in our space, but the organizers are a fairly new set of professionals. At Stand for Children, had a great experience there. And most of the success was largely by the way we built our teams, right? So as an organizer myself, going into major low-income communities in the district that's underperforming, as a whole, I focused on first finding people in every building that had some capacity to be an advocate. And you would be surprised in most low income communities, like you ask people, like, what's your first target? Who should you talk to first? You know, in parents, because, you know, parents, that's a broad spectrum. In the African American community, they would usually say mothers, you know, or in any economic sense, they would kind of say, well, you talk to the mothers, you know, and they have, you know, capacity to do things. Down south, you know, we literally built the first organizing cohort off of African American men, right? So if you had a male in the home, they had more capacity while the wife is taking care of the children to come out to meetings to get updated. And then there are heavy influences of others. So we started out focusing on specific subset of people that had capacity. And then amongst my organizing core, the actual paid organizers, I always focused on hiring organizers that were parents themselves, right? And so in Andrew's paper, you met Khadijah, which is a phenomenal young lady, had her first child at 14 years old, but then went on to get her master's degree. So her as an organizer, going in to talk to other parents that maybe feel like they don't have any hope, was just extremely powerful. I didn't get to hang out with them, but I think you went out with parents too, right? They took a group of parents and just kind of hung out, and it's just amazing the transformation when they have that relatability. And then also local leadership is important, and this is kind of an ode to my people at 50 Can, really focusing on local leadership, finding people that know the culture of where they are and how to move people is very, very important. Back to John a minute on people. One of the powerful things in his research talked about social networks and students, the power of that, and the finding that parents really rely heavily on social networks as opposed to formal sources in making school decisions. And sometimes we forget, you know, like great schools. I mean, when my oldest son, went to elementary school, great schools didn't even exist, right? This is 98. Likewise, school letter grades, in most places, less than 10 years where you actually had school letter grades. So you have a whole group of parents that are not used to using those tools to actually make decisions, right? So it's a new thing. Personal story, I have a son now that's a sophomore in college. I know I look young, thank you. And I have a son that's a sophomore in high school. But with my oldest son, you know, it was just word of mouth. You know, where are you sending your kids to school? What is the good school, right? And then with my youngest, I had more formal things to go off of, namely the experience of my younger son, my oldest son, to go off of. And so I think those social networks are really, really important. And I think when you look at social networks, as children are younger, the word of mouth from parent to parent is most important. But as they get older, what the student says is very, very important. I remember my oldest son, he plays basketball. And so in ninth grade, he had a basketball coach change at his high school, and he didn't like the school anymore, right? He wanted to go to another school. And so, you know, I kind of fought with him back and forth. And then his grades start going down, right? And so I talked to his mom, and she was like, you know, he's just trying to get out of that school, really, you know. and lo and behold, we had some conversations, moved him to another school. He went from being a B student, a 3.2, to a 4.3 grade point average, right? So children have more control than you think over where they go to school and how they respond to that. So that's the first observation, that people matter. The second is the expansion of choice has some undiscussed potential that we haven't really discussed. And Andrew's discussion of the status quo in parent engagement, you should go, I think around page 11, look at those figures 1 and 2, really powerful that, you know, no matter what economic bracket they're in, parents really are not involved in the political side of schools. And choice is like a misnomer for working families. I mean, choice, you look at vouchers, you look at charters, vouchers in Louisiana are for people that are 250% of poverty. I don't even know what that number is, right? But it's something really, really low. And then most of the charters come in as no excuses models in, inner city areas where we're at. So it's not really a choice for a parent that's working. It's not like a real choice. And when you look at the expansion of true choice, if we ever expand choice and have high quality charters in places where all parents are, you get that selective incentive that Olson talks about that then motivates them. And so we can probably go a little bit deeper to talk about how we organize and mobilize people around that selective incentive. And it's powerful. I mean, it would blow your mind what people will do when they have something to gain from it. So that's the second piece, is that, choice really has some potential that we haven't tapped yet. And then the last question, we talk about how social networks are really, really important to mobilizing people, but we're not really building socially focused organizations. So my question is, like, why are we not taking what we know, like we're trying to reinvent something else, to pull that local leadership with some relatable messengers and some students to really get to where we want to go. And I think we need to be more thoughtful about that. Thank you.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. And in a tight 10. That was outstanding. By the way, we're going to have some conversation after this. Okay, good. So we're going to have a conversation about your diet or something. I want to know what you're in on, that you still look like that having a sophomore in college. Must be eating right, something. Anyway, so next up, we have Bill Jackson. So we've heard lots of remarks about great schools. It was key in some of the work that John did and what Raymond was talking about. Well, Bill is the CEO and founder of Great Schools, which is a leading U.S. nonprofit working at the intersection of parents and education, or parenting and education, giving information to parents as they make decisions. So take it away.
Thank you, Michael. John, thank you for all that research, which for us has been really thought-provoking and caused us to do some things differently. Joanna, Heather, thank you for being here from Great Schools. So if any of you want to talk more about any of our work around the country, the two of those are also from Great Schools in the audience here. Yep. All right, a couple of thoughts. I want to talk about, reflect on what we've heard today. First, sort of category of topic is innovations that we're pursuing more at the conceptual level in response to some of these findings, primarily John's, but a little bit of Andrew's as well. Second, I want to talk about a concept I might call root demand. So there is Stand for Children, for example, or other parent organizing groups in the political sphere would be seeking to turn out parents to a school board meeting or to a state hearing about a policy. But then there is another layer, I think, of demand, which we should raise and discuss a little bit here, which is, is the thing I'm getting over here at Lincoln Elementary School good enough for my kid? Right? So that's what I would call root demand for educational quality or excellence. But starting with the first, a couple of sort of interesting, somewhat minor points, but I think it's important for policymakers or advocates to think about them. We have learned, for better or worse, that ratings are taken. You hinted at this, John. You could do a lousy job of ratings. Is there anybody named John in the audience? If so, raise your hand. Other than John Vallant, John. Thank you, John. You could publish John's guide to schools in the District of Columbia tomorrow, and just go randomly make up ratings that you thought. And if you designed the book that you publish in to look very authoritative, you could instantly have significant influence over the opinions of people in the district over the quality of the various schools. So this book, you're going to be on that tomorrow? Good. And if anybody wants to compete with John in the audience, I highly encourage it. It could make things interesting. They are taken at face value. And we sometimes wonder, gee, there's this issue with our calculation that makes, Louisiana's ratings a little different than Colorado's ratings, and like parents don't care. If there's a general brand, okay, there's some relationship to credibility and the brand of the organization, but there's very little digging beneath the hood to know. And it's rational, right? You're not gonna, when you go to Consumer Reports, you sort of you look at those ratings and you say, oh, that's Consumer Reports. It must be right, even if there's some crazy stuff going on there. I want to raise the issue of fit, because there is good research showing, particularly if you're a high-need student, where more of your education is going to depend on what happens in the school. So a school-dependent learner would be another way to say that. That going to a higher-performing school is really quite beneficial for your prospects to graduating prepared for higher education. But there's an area of research that I'd love to see, we'd love at Great Schools to see more done, which is the question of fit. Some kids shouldn't go to that no excuses, high-performing charter school because it's just not the right thing for them. Some kids should go to the little looser, a little more creative, a little more student. The students have more influence over what is going to happen in their education. And this is an area which I think is really begging for research is how much of what we're trying to do when we make a market work well is a function of tagging quality and then encouraging or nudging towards quality versus how much is really trying to make the dance work well, so that there's no one best boy or girl over there or partner for your dance. There's the one that you want, but you have to find that person or that school and know the different qualities that they have so that match can be made. Want to raise the prospect also in response to some of the challenges you raised about making about students. Two thoughts related to this issue of 8th grade students playing a big role in choosing high schools. One is we really ought to try, and we at Great Schools are working on this, providing information to students which, as they're looking at the different high school options available to them, we could put in big, large letters the percentage chance that they, with the grade point average or the test scores that they have, if they go to this school, that they will graduate in 4 years ready, eligible and ready, and to not only to be admitted, but to be successful as a freshman in say the state university. And we could do that. In some places, we have the longitudinal kind of data to do that, and that would be, so John, if you're looking for another experiment to run, let's talk afterwards. A second point is how might we make the choice process more social? So Raymond, you're hinting at that, is like how advocacy is social. It's like, am I letting anybody down? Well, could we do that with 8th graders choosing high schools such that the Posse, as some of you may have heard of the nonprofit Posse, group Posse, which is trying to help typically low-income young people more successful in college by sending them as a group, and where they're able to rely on and learn from each other and support each other. And how might we change some choosing patterns by thinking of the unit of intervention is more the group rather than the individual student? We'd love to experiment with that as well. I have a bunch of other ideas related to, one piece of data I think we really ought to do a better job pulling out in guides like Great Schools is teacher quality. So I can't go to we haven't figured out any way to go to Lincoln Elementary School and tell you whether the 3rd grade teacher is a good teacher. We keep asking the District of Columbia Public Schools for the distribution of teachers and the impact evaluation system to put that up at a particular school. They haven't given it to us yet. Anybody from DCPS here? Want to talk to you afterwards? But another thing that we could do, which I think would be very powerful, is if any of you have been to a school like Rocket Ship, one of the charter high-performing CMOs, or Aspire Public Schools, and some districts, they do an amazing job of recruiting, supporting, improving the capacity of teachers. We should tag school profiles with some kind of rating that gets at the system's ability and attention and capacity to recruit and cultivate, measure, and perfect the teaching, the quality of teaching, even their effort to do so, the design of the system. Because if a little bit of research, you can make some really nice categorizations as this system really isn't even trying, all the way to this system is trying really hard. And I think that could get at the number one thing that parents want to know around choosing a school often is how good will my child's teachers be? So with that, there's other ideas but don't have time for those. There's other ideas I have, but we could talk after if anybody wants to. When I get to this idea of root demand. So when Stan, for example, goes out and tries to organize parents for political action, it would be great if they could recruit in a climate where more parents were dissatisfied with what they were getting because they had been able to connect the dots between what they were getting and their child's not having the future opportunity that they wanted for their child. President Obama, I heard this story through the chief of staff to the Secretary of Education. He went to Korea. He was talking to the president of Korea. Gee, how things going? What are your issues these days? And the president of Korea told Obama, and this side conversation at some point, the parents, I can't get them off my back. We start foreign language education in Korea, and it's a national education system. I don't know these details, but something like third grade. And they're insisting that we start foreign language education in first grade, right? And President Obama turned to the president of South Korea and said, I don't have that problem, right? So this is kind of highlighting what I call root demand, like what is good enough for my child. And so, a lot of the countries where there is more of this, there are gateway tests where the stakes are on the child or in the family, that if my child doesn't reach some level on this national test, they don't get to go one of the best in China. They couldn't go to a really good high school, or they won't get into college at all, or their college won't be paid for in Europe the way it is if you're in a certain level of performance on a test. That's one way, but I think we ought to look at other ways and spend a lot of a time as we think about the future of educational reform or improvement at how do we cultivate that root demand for wanting better, that academically, social, emotional environment that my child is in, the programming range, so that when you're recruiting, it's a little bit less of a leap to go from that more what can sometimes seem as an abstract policy, like, wait, what's my relationship to what's going on in Baton Rouge around teacher evaluation? We got a long way to go before there's that connection drawn. If that could be a shorter journey, because more parents are like, what I got here is not good enough for my child. So those are some thoughts.
Thank you. And finally, we have Ms. Cara Kerwin, who is the president of the Center for Education Reform. I note in her bio, it says she's a frequent speaker and panelist on education reform. She's actually a frequent speaker here. So if that's like a sample of it, like you're all over town doing this. So it's great. She's a great friend of AEI education here, and really excited to hear her thoughts.
Thanks once again for having us. I think the only reason why I might be on this panel is because when I saw Andrew's paper come up maybe a couple weeks ago, I was like, hey, wait, we've been doing parent power for a really, really long time. Why am I not on that list? Why isn't our organization? And a lot of it is because we've just helped others in states and local communities over the years to create their own groups organically. We don't have like sort of our logo on it. But anyway, your next paper, you can include CER in it. So the one thing that I know from my history in engaging parents and cultivating parents and educating parents about their options is that really information is power. And both of these papers do touch on that. In fact, John, one of the most important things I think you said was successfully informing the public is not easy. Schools are complicated institutions tasked with serving many goals, and good measures of their success in achieving these goals can be elusive. That really struck me in such a way, and then to tie it to Andrew's paper, talking about how we've essentially disenfranchised parents from the process to be politically active in schools because we've essentially forced them to be intimidated by it. Our schools, going back to the Chubb quote you had in the paper, but our schools have been designed, even though parents are the biggest consumers of our schools. They've been designed to be really about serving the needs of those people running our schools. So it's disenfranchised parents from really actively engaging. So going back to that sort of information is power theme, tying both together. The other point I wanted to bring up is also sort of the two-through idea. And then to your point about the types of schools and fit. And then the final piece is really how do we get this done? Both papers do touch on that, and that's truly like whether or not it's organic, who the people are, and how people get information. So first, information is power, and I thought, John, your paper was really really informative about how people make decisions, and I loved how you really focused on the parent as the chooser. I'm a parent who used grade schools myself to find my daughter's school, and I actually didn't look necessarily at grades. I looked at what people were commenting about, and so that was really helpful to me, and someone who does this stuff for a living, I actually wasn't looking at test scores. So, that was one thing that, you actually spoke to me on that. And it is true, because that's how parents get information. We were here just a couple weeks ago, Mike. Remember, Patrick Wolf was discussing his big study on the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program and how parents made those choices. And there was so much more that parents value about making choices about their kids' schools that we don't, in the education reform space, truly appreciate. Test scores, as John, as you pointed out, aren't the first thing parents look for. They're like, they want to know whether or not it passes sort of their common sense test. Like, do they go in to a building and feel like safe? Have they heard from other people whether or not it's a good school? There's some of them, especially those that like in Milwaukee or DC, where they have private school choice available to them. Character and religious education is really important to them, where they value that regardless of the test scores. And so until we can actually appreciate and put more value on what parents value, we're not going to be able to create the right kind of market for choice to truly, truly be happening and driving sort of, what kind of schools we're creating. So to that, it's that two-through, and the fit discussion. A lot of, we keep saying that these are the types of schools that they should have, but that's not the one-size-fits-all sort of model doesn't work for everybody. So where you were saying a lot, Raymond, a lot of schools were sort of that no excuses kind of approach, but that's not always the right fit. Some students need something else. And so listening to parents about the choices they want to make and listening to students is going to help us create a healthier market, and that's actually what the intent of the school choice movement was supposed to be about. It was supposed to be about parent-driven decisions, but we've lost sight of that. We've seen one model or a few models be successful, and we've said, okay, that's the one we got to put in every single city, instead of listening to parents. So again, as reformers, we need to be looking at not this top-down, Andrew, as you brought up in your paper, but really kind of from the ground up, what's important to parents. And that also goes for engagement, Raymond, as you brought up a little bit too. The two-through, there's a lot of organizations, and Andrew touches on this, as the AstroTurf groups or even the AfroTurf groups, and I thought that was really a great classification. There's a lot of groups out there in our space, both proponents and opponents of education reform, who claim that they've got the parent voice, but they're actually just doing it to people. But where you have the most successful and lasting substantive change is when it's through the community. So here in the District of Columbia, Friendship Public Charter Schools said, we're going to work through our community. Most of their teachers are from their own community. They have really focused on making the empowerment about the community with which they are working in. I've gone knocking on doors in Camden, Compton, but it was all because it wasn't because I was coming out there as a national organization trying to tell people what to do. I was invited by somebody to come out that the people in the community trusted to get information about maybe some of their options. So it goes to the two-through. People need to trust their resources, trust their information. And that's how we'll have greater impact. Again, my last piece about the who, the how, is also the way we present information, the way people digest information is truly organic. I can get a booklet from somebody and it tells me, okay, this is the type of school you should have. And if I trust that, or it looks like it's a local source, I trust it more. But grassroots and parent organizing and parent information is not always perfect, and it's messy, John. As you even said in your paper, like the information we provide people is not always clear, and it is kind of messy. And so we have to be better at making it more organic, making it more about the community leaders, our Rotaries, our chambers. They need to know how to engage people themselves instead of, top-down sort of efforts to reform a community. Because, again, the lasting, sustainable efforts are those that are really from the ground up. Some of the most powerful reform efforts have been led by parents. And back in the day when education reform really did take off, it was parents. It was Janet Barisi, who was just recently the former state superintendent in Oklahoma. She was just a mom. In fact, she was just a mom really frustrated with her kids' schools and found our website. Back then, we were one of the only websites. She said, oh, this charter school thing sounds cool. So here's a mom who was a dentist, decided to create a group. Excuse me, I have a bad cold. Create a group and then basically create that state's first charter school law. She then created the first charter school. She then went on to create the first organization to help bring more charter schools to the state. Parents really can drive it if we empower them to do so organically from the ground up. And I think both of your papers really do make that connection as the need that we have to pay attention to that more in order for true empowerment to happen. Excuse me. I'm all done before my cold takes over. Yeah.
Well, great. Yes, thank you. This is wonderful. As mentioned, it's already a robust conversation happening on Twitter, which is great. Glad to have all of you folks joining. I'm going to take the host prerogative and ask a couple questions, and then turn it over to the audience. So again, those of you that are following along on the hashtag AEI Parent Power, please continue. So my first question, I'd like to actually kick it back to John, because there was a lot of conversation up here about social networks and the role that social networks can play. So in the research that you did, even when parents had information from kind of an anonymous parent, but it was identified as a parent, it had an incredibly large effect on their opinions of schools. It would seem to me that parents coming from their social network would have an even larger effect. Does that seem true? Or what sort of role do you see in social networks, perhaps even amplifying some of the things that you found?
So I think that's right. Cara said that when she was choosing a school, that she was paying more attention on the Great School site to the comments than she was the ratings. And I find that, even for myself, I'm in this world of data, and it seems like I should be paying attention to data. And I have 2 young kids. When I was buying strollers and car seats, I wasn't getting Consumer Reports. I was going on Amazon and reading whatever God knows who posts Amazon reviews said about the strollers and the car seats. And I think it's a really human response that we want to hear voices that sound familiar to us, that sound like someone's describing a child who could be my child or a child I care about. And to the extent that those voices are actual voices we know, and maybe even voices that know our kids and can sort of credibly speak to what might be good for my kid, I think it only strengthens the case.
Great, thank you. Andrew, I wanted to respond. I thought Raymond said a very interesting thing on the panel as he was talking about how people matter. He made this distinction between sort of message and messengers, and it seemed like you would be the person to ask, has education reform and education reformers, have they focused too much on message and not enough on messengers? Is that what's sort of happening here, or how do you see that relationship but on their part?
I think this is whether they have or not, it's an enormous liability for them. I think they're seen that way by the opposition. They're seen as, frankly, often a cadre of very highly educated, affluent white people lobbying in state capitals and in districts to get changes implemented that may or may not have a constituency at all, right? And I don't think that that's necessarily true across the board. I think it's a caricature, but I think it's a liability for education reform. And I think, Howard Fuller says this all the time, right? And Howard's the man on charting the evolution of ed reform over the past 20 years, right, or more than that. And he always mentions the fact that the rooms, in which we discuss these issues don't look like the classrooms in the cities that where we're trying to improve schools, right, or the rural districts where we're trying to improve schools. And so I do think that's a problem. I think the tricky part is has to do with this AstroTurf versus authentic grassroots organizing, and I think that groups haven't quite figured out how to negotiate that tension, because there's a desire to have authentic spokespeople for these positions, but my concern is that when push comes to shove, the position overcomes the authenticity. It counts for more than the authenticity. And not for all groups. I think some groups are different in that regard. But I think that's a problem. And it's deeply rooted in lots of the dynamics in ed reform, from funders to the policy debate.
Sure. I was actually going to give Raymond a chance to respond, and then Kara, you should jump in next, because I would assume this is something that you, now working in several of these organizations, have been struggling. I would love to hear your response to that.
So a couple of things. When we talk about messengers, and I mentioned the New Choice class, right, which are kind of poor people of color. I think one of the things we have to step back, and you just said something about authenticity, right? Anybody that has a concern can be authentic, right? So it doesn't have to be a poor black person at the Capitol, right, for it to be like, because, I'm a parent, you're a parent. So I think we've got ourselves into a corner where it's all about poor people of color, which is not. I mean, like in Louisiana, we're 50th in the state, so all parents are getting shafted, right? And so a lot of times you talked about root demand, and I wrote that down because that's actually what we did. We organized in the recovery school district schools, right, which parents, they understand this school has been an F for at least 5 years, and they had a real concern. But then we likewise went into traditional district schools that were like mixed magnet schools, where they had a traditional population and a magnet population. So it's like an A school and an F school in one, and the parents couldn't figure out how to deal with that. And so you didn't really have to sell them anything, because you're just giving them a vehicle to make something better that they already know in some sense needs to be better, whether it's a school grade or whether it's their kid is getting bullied every day. And so I just think we should be thoughtful about not being put into a corner about who the messengers could be. And I think we should focus too, not just on the New Choice class, which is this group of people that never had a choice, but then other parents that may be middle class parents that, yeah, we had a choice, but it's either the choice is like private school or a magnet school, but it's really not a choice. It's not a real choice. And we talk about choice a lot, but you're just talking about this one group of new people and not universally choice.
Sure. Kara, you wanted to get in there?
Yes. So I have a slightly different opinion about sustainable groups, and I don't necessarily think, and it's been my experience, and partially the reason why the Center for Education Reform has never really created chapters is because sometimes the groups or the spokespeople come and go based on a particular need that they have. So in Patrick Wolf's study on the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, when parents were threatened with losing their scholarship, their choice, they got active. They became politically motivated. In New York City, as Andrew points out in his paper, parents at families for or Yes, yes, for excellent schools. You know, there's a reason why you had all these people crossing the Brooklyn Bridge because they were being threatened by the bully de Blasio. So parents do have, you know, they will act when they know that their choice is being threatened. I don't necessarily think that you have to have a group per se always there to like try and cultivate or keep an email list, because I think you're going to get the most passionate people or impactful or best spokespeople or best messengers when there's actually something tangible that they can do. And again, parents, you know, and their efforts come and go. When my own daughter, I had Debbie Downer in her classroom, and I was just, man, every day, this teacher is driving me crazy. And a bunch of other parents got active around it. It's actually very intimidating to get active. As somebody who teaches people how to do this all the time, it's scary. But we did it. I'm done. I'm happy. My issue's resolved. I don't really need to continue to have a parent group that's going to work on that one issue. And so I would just argue that sometimes sustaining it is not necessarily, like, you don't need to have an organization or a group. You just have to make sure that the information continues to flow in a good way to people.
Sure. So, Bill, changing directions slightly, and I think, John, I might kick it to you after Bill talks about it. So I was really interested in your conversation about fit, trying to understand how schools fit in that. But one of the takeaways I kind of get from John's paper is that the types and manner in which information is presented can sort of shape the decision patterns that people make. So I'd be interested in how you as an organization have sort of wrestled with understanding that how you present information and what information you choose to present, and perhaps even where, you know, if it's the first thing that parents see or if they have to search for it, might shape the decisions that they make. How have you thought through trying to give people that information in a way where there might be multiple options that could be seen as acceptable choices?
Right. So that's a tough question. I'll do my best. So one thing is now, we have learned starting a couple years ago that we have to take a more local approach to building really high quality information, and also to reaching and engaging families who may not be Googling, who may not be coming to us, to go out to them and stir the pot of like, gee, what's out there and what could you choose? So taking a local approach, and then getting that local approach can allow, and we did this now in some form or another in 12 different cities or states, kind of in depth, maybe in around 6 or 8 cities in one state. And that allows us, for the most part, to get really good information about programmatically, particularly at a small state or in a city, a lot of different programmatic characteristics of a school. What sports does the school have? What arts programs? What is there a kind of a philosophy of learning, or is it Montessori, or is it et cetera, et cetera? All these different kind of tags or qualities of a school that are not, it's not good or bad to want a Montessori education for your kid. If you want one, you should be able to find where it's made available. So, going local, and then if you go to a place like, for example, Delaware, if you go and look at great schools on Delaware, it's one of our most advanced, or Indianapolis is another example of this. If you go to great schools in Indianapolis and you look for a school, you put in your address, you'll see, okay, what's my assigned school? But then you're going to see two kind of big important things. You're going to see a rating for each school in the list, and then you're going to see a fit score. It's a good fit. If you said, I want after school care and I want boys basketball, and STEM is really a great idea for engaging my middle schooler or high schooler, you're going to see a smile, a fit score, and like a high fit against that on each school in the list. Next to the rating, which currently is based on a test score, but both growth as well as absolute status, or for high schools, various measures of college readiness, graduation rates and college readiness for the high schools. So there's a lot of possible directions we could go in the future, but those are some of the way that's the way we're evolving our service to better address this issue.
Sure. So, John, I'd be interested to know sort of how your research and what you found might inform that process.
Sure. So a couple thoughts on that. One is, I think we need to think about how information can affect the people who consume it. And so we often think in terms of people, they might be looking at these couple of schools, and so we'll provide some information about the schools and we sort of fill in gaps in their knowledge, and then they can adjust what they think about it positively or negatively. There's a deep body of research showing that when authority figures issue information, it sends signals about what's legitimate. And so if a government or if an organization like Great Schools, just in what it chooses to highlight in its school profiles, if it's putting test scores in a school profile or graduation rate, there's something being communicated about this is what you ought to be paying attention to. And so I think in part, there's some thought that has to go into there's a responsibility on the provider side in terms of thinking about what is it that we think is fair to steer people toward, because it will often steer people toward this. And then I think a second part of it, especially with, I think this is where my head goes with FIT a bit, is informing people who don't yet have kids in the schools can be tough. So I'm trying to pick an elementary school a year or two down the road for my 3-year-old, and I feel like I don't have any idea about New Orleans elementary schools. So I'll lean quite a bit on social networks. Helping, another way that information can help people like me and just sort of help the system as a whole is to make people who are already in the system, parents who already have kids who are attending a school, be better, smarter critics of what they're seeing in their own kids' classrooms. Because I think often where judgments of fit come is it comes through conversations with people you know who know something about your kid, or you may know something about their kids. And when that voice speaks authoritatively, and to the extent that it's informed because that person knows kind of what to look for if there is a way to look, I think you can get it fit. There are ways for us to inform social networks and indirectly support choice that are worth pursuing.
Great. Well, I think I'd like to turn it over to the audience now to ask questions. Again, those of you that are following along at home can tweet questions to hashtag AEI Parent Power. You can tweet them directly at me. I'm at MQ_McShane. But we'll start. We generally, at AEI events, for those of you that haven't been to one, we have 2 rules that we follow. One, I just ask you to identify yourself when you stand up. And number 2 would be to actually ask a question. So as much as I would appreciate a soliloquy, we have limited time, and I think people who want to ask questions. So anybody who's interested, I'd love to. We have one down front, and if you could wait till the microphone gets to you.
Thank you, guys. I'm Cody Christensen. I'm a research intern at the Brown Center on Education Policy. Raymond, I have a question. You were talking about this old group of parents who aren't used to having all this information available, such as Great School. And then on top of that, John, you were talking about how individuals are boundedly rational, so they're quick to settle on a school even though it might not be their best school. My question to combat kind of that issue is, if school districts rolled back a default assignment zone based off a geographical location, essentially forced families to make a choice, do you think that that would be a step forward for school choice and essentially lead to better results if you could force the parents to choose, or would that be harmful in some ways? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for calling me old. That's good. But I would say that would probably be a step back, because that's what's been done for years and years, right? You live in a zip code, that's the school you go to, and it's no promise of quality. I think choice, especially in New Orleans with 100% charter district and the choices that are coming in other similar districts, you want parents to be able to go wherever. If you force them to go to one school, the school district has no incentive to provide anything phenomenal because of No Child Left Behind and some other accountability things in Louisiana. If a school is an F school, the district is compelled to notify the parent and give them an option to another school. But the option that you're getting is maybe a D school, right? And they say, well, we're not a felon school anymore. But it's a D, that's felon, right? And so I think that would definitely be a step back to have mandatory assignment.
So this is the world that we live in New Orleans now. New Orleans has done away with its residential-based school assignment, so your address does not assign you to a traditional public school anymore. And I think so. Something that we hear often from New Orleans parents that resonates with me, that I think is important and gets to some of Andrew's points about speaking respectfully and honestly to the people who are in these communities, is New Orleans right now has a whole lot of families who pay a lot of money to send their kids to private school. And then they have a public school system that's varied in quality, but has a lot of schools that are not there yet. And so what what people often say is, well, the people with money, what they do is they enter this public lottery system, and if they get one of the really desirable schools, they send their kids for a free, really good education in the public school system. And if they don't, then they pay the money and they get in the private school system and they still get a really good education. What happens for us is if we enter the same lottery system and you say it's fair and you say it's choice, and if we don't get one of those schools that everyone else is trying to get, then we end up in one of the schools that no one wants to go to. And that may be more choice than there was before. It may be a better situation than it was before, but it's not fair. And it's understandably insulting to people who hear that and hear that they have lots of choice. So I think there's a way to talk about what the situation really is, and to be honest with, this is where we're going and this is how we're getting there. That at least in New Orleans, I think may get there, but is not there yet.
Great.
Jump in on one thing. One of the things I've heard people discuss is just that there's actually an immense transaction cost to a system that is choice, that is fully every parent has a choice, and you're not assigned to your geographic district anymore, which is that you have to reapply every year, right? And I remember when I visited Raymond in Baton Rouge, right, there was actually a discussion about, well, remember to get your reapplication in, or whatever, whatever they call it, right? Which is, from behavioral economics, we sort of know that people are going to be, that's going to be a painful process for them, and it may even lead them to be potentially less savvy as consumers, right? Just be like, I just want to stick with the default. It's such a pain to do this every year, so on. I just think these are things that again, surprisingly or not surprisingly, technocratic ed reformers haven't thought a whole lot about.
Can you say just a little bit more about the sort of default, what behavioral economics tells us about sort of defaults versus others? I think that's an important point.
Sure. I mean, it suggests that even microscopic hurdles, right, to filling out a one-page form can be enough to dissuade people from actually taking advantage of particular benefits that they could be eligible for. And so, as we think about kind of part of making choice universal is actually having, raises the transaction cost in some sense.
And it's something it's observed across. This isn't just an education thing. It's seeing these.
Yeah, and it's just right, and we just need to do a cost benefit calculation to say, well, are the benefits of applying, of having universal choice, do they outweigh some of these costs that we put on parents? But it is a real concern.
Sure.
I also would add, once the government got involved in helping people make those decisions, it sort of lessened, I guess, the choice. So I would say, John, to your point, that it's sort of insulting to people to say that we have all this choice, but they really don't. And again, it's because there's certain people, they just don't know how to allow people to make decisions themselves, or try to control a market where they don't even know what markets are. So I would say that you're absolutely dead on with that notion that, we supposedly have all this choice now in Louisiana or New Orleans, but they really that necessarily don't. So.
Sure. Other questions from the audience? We have one right up here.
Rashawn Biddle, editor, Dropout Nation. One thing I haven't heard, parent trigger.
Oh.
Why aren't we having this conversation?
Yeah. So I would say, from the organizing standpoint, just the resources that it takes to do a parent trigger is just a really high bar to cross a lot. I mean, in Louisiana, the letter grades come out in October, and and you only have 90 days to get a petition signed between October and the day the trigger happens. So with you not really being able to calculate from a individual standpoint, I mean, with Common Core and everything, you have all these suppressions of data. So you can't, as a parent, figure out if your school is going to be a D or F school. And then to mobilize and educate parents within a 90-day cycle to get 50% plus one to sign a petition, it's just hard to do. And so I think down south, that's been the barrier. And in other places, too. I mean, yeah, you have a parent trigger piece of legislation, but the constraints on that are such that, it just takes forever to do, and you really can't cross that high bar. So you say, do I put all of my resources toward that, or do I put my resources toward recruiting a high quality charter school to come here? And a lot of times, a lot of people just go a different direction rather than just going the trigger direction.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Well,
I mean, but here's the question. I'm going to put it bluntly.
Right.
But doesn't that ignore the reality that, I'm going to put it this way, for the average parent in the community, that school is their home. That you're basically, okay, we want to, because again, even with or without the letter grades, you're going to know that that school's been failing for 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. But this is your school. As we've seen in school closing discussions, this is their school, and they want to take over their school.
Sure.
Again, why haven't folks figured out? Again, the restrictions. Believe me, Louisiana's law, ridiculous. I'd rather have California's, but put the work in. That's what it comes down.
Yeah.
Put the
Let me
work
jump.
in.
Let me jump
Yeah,
in
Andrew.
here quickly. So, Parent Revolution is a group that I interviewed a lot and relied on them in this work because they have a very different approach to this all, obviously, than STAND or Students First or BAYO or others, because they are the parent trigger group. And what I would say is, it doesn't answer your question directly, but one of the things that they're figuring out now is their version of implementation is what happens once parents actually successfully trigger a school, right? And then they have to own that process, and they have to sustain the parents' attention over time. And they're working on it, but they're finding that challenging, right? Because it's one of those sort of be careful what you wish for situations, because what happens if that school doesn't turn around immediately, right? What happens after you pull the trigger? It's not an argument against parent trigger. It's just a suggestion that the actual implementation of this on the ground is really challenging beyond just the restrictions and the ante, the things before you pull the trigger. So I think it factors pretty prominently in my paper, but for reasons that are not just I don't just suggest that parent trigger is a great policy, but try to dig into it a little bit more than that and say what are people struggling with on that front.
And to build off what Andrew said too, in most cities, Detroit, you look at the state of Tennessee, in Louisiana, you have other options too, right? Because you have recovery school districts that are compelled to take the schools, and most of their theory of change is to take the school and then to charter it out. So you get the same result, maybe quicker through the recovery school district mechanism, because if a school, the parent trigger is more expanded, it could be a D or F school. With the recovery school districts, and the achievement school district is even different than our recovery school district. The state takes it and then it charters the school out. And so it's still a way to get a better school without doing the trigger mechanism.
Well,
Yeah.
But it still seems to forget for a moment, forget what Kara makes a good point about, which is the parents.
Right.
The mom and dad in the neighborhood versus, okay, the recovery school district or the commissioner's compact in Connecticut, which frankly, a lot of folks just, it works well in Louisiana, but there's a lot of folks in Connecticut, a lot of folks in Detroit who are like, frankly, we don't like this. Thank you, send this, don't bring this home to us.
Well, just quickly, one thing, Parent Revolution, when I talk with them, their theory of change is not just let's organize a bunch of parent trigger campaigns. Actually, what they're trying to do now is cultivate enough parent union chapters in various schools around the state, and in a particular district, such that they can actually bring together a group of parents who have been part of a trigger campaign to then push for district level change, because they, even sort of the parents of the parent trigger legislation don't see it as sufficient for systemic reform. And so to me that's telling. So.
Well, friends, I think on that note, it is the witching hour. I'd like to give our panelists a nice round of applause. So this event will go up on AEI's YouTube page if you'd like to go back and relive the magic. Other than that, it was great having you guys here. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Mike.